I cannot believe this is happening again. What am I gonna do?
When wealthy parents discovered their simple nanny was secretly completing her PhD, they thought it was cute, until her graduation speech exposed the truth about inequality that left the entire auditorium speechless. What they didn't know was that their daily humiliation had been witnessed by someone who would soon command the attention of thousands. In the marble foyer of the Pemberton mansion, Sandra Martinez moves quietly, her worn sneakers making barely a whisper against the polished floors, like a ghost navigating through someone else's dream. The scent of expensive perfume mingles with fresh orchids, while crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns across walls lined with oil paintings worth more than most people's homes. No one knows that tucked inside her faded backpack, between juice, boxes, and coloring books, lies a dissertation that could change how America thinks about education. No one even notices when she catches their children's math homework errors or gently corrects their Spanish pronunciation with the fluency of someone who once taught linguistics at university level. But when Victoria Pemberton and her book club friends struggle with helping their teenagers understand advanced calculus, Sandra observes from the kitchen doorway, her hands still wet from washing their crystal wine glasses. She watches them fumble through concepts she could explain in her sleep, their manicured fingers pointing helplessly at equations that might as well be hieroglyphics. "This is impossible," Victoria sighs, her diamond bracelet catching the afternoon light. "How are we supposed to help Emma with this college prep when we can barely understand it ourselves?" "Maybe we should hire another tutor," suggests Margaret Chen, adjusting her Hermes scarf, though the last one charged 300 per hour. Sandra steps forward, her voice soft but steady. "Actually, that's a polynomial derivative. If you factor out the coefficient first." The women turn, their perfectly contoured faces showing a mixture of surprise and barely concealed amusement. Victoria's smile doesn't reach her eyes as she exchanges glances with her friends. "Oh, Sandra," she laughs, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "That's sweet of you to try, but this is advanced mathematics. Maybe you could focus on getting the children ready for their piano lessons instead?" What they didn't know was that Sandra Martinez had spent 5 years completing her doctoral dissertation on educational inequality while changing diapers and packing lunch boxes. Her research on how socioeconomic assumptions impact learning had been quietly accepted by Harvard's Graduate School of Education. And with just one phone call to the university, she was about to transform not only her own life, but challenge everything this family believed about worth, intelligence, and respect. Because sometimes the most profound wisdom comes wrapped in the most humble packaging. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimes 3 times, its deep resonance seeming to mark more than just the hour. Sandra returns to the kitchen, but something in her posture has shifted. Her shoulders are straighter, her movements more deliberate. She pulls out her phone and scrolls to a contact she hasn't called in months. Dr. Patricia Williams, her dissertation advisor. Her thumb hovers over the number as voices drift from the living room. "Can you imagine?" Victoria's voice carries clearly. "Our nanny thinking she can help with calculus. Next thing you know, she'll be offering career advice." The laughter that follows is sharp and cutting, but Sandra doesn't flinch. Instead, she presses call. "Dr. Williams, it's Sandra Martinez. Yes, I know it's been a while since we discussed my defense date. Actually, I'd like to move it up, and I have a special request about the location." Through the kitchen window, she can see the children playing in the backyard. Emma, struggling with confidence. Little Michael, whose learning differences the family dismisses as laziness. And teenage Ryan, who confided in Sandra about his anxiety around academic performance. These children she's grown to love, despite their parents' treatment of her. Anti-trivu. She ends the call. Sandra touches the small silver cross at her throat. A gift from her grandmother, who cleaned houses her entire life, but somehow managed to send Sandra to college on scholarships and prayers. Mija, her grandmother used, to say, respect is not given, it is commanded through excellence. The late afternoon sun streams through the kitchen window, illuminating the acceptance letter she's kept hidden in her backpack for 3 months. Harvard University. Doctor of Education. Summa cum laude. In 2 weeks, she'll walk across that stage. But first, she has an invitation to extend. The sound of expensive heels clicking across marble grows closer, and Sandra quickly tucks the letter away. Victoria appears in the doorway, her expression expectant. Sandra, darling, we're having a dinner party Friday night. 8 couples, very important. I'll need you to stay late with the children and perhaps help serve. Sandra meets her gaze steadily. Of course, Mrs. Pemberton, but I should mention, I have something important happening next week that might require some schedule adjustments. Oh? Victoria's tone suggests mild irritation. Nothing too disruptive, I hope. Sandra's smile is gentle, but there's something new behind her eyes. A quiet confidence that wasn't there an hour ago. Just a graduation ceremony. Nothing you'd need to worry about. Before we continue with Sandra's incredible journey, I need you to do something for me. If this story is already giving you goosebumps, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel is dedicated to sharing real stories about underdogs who triumph against all odds. And trust me, Sandra's story is about to get so much more powerful. Rate this opening on a scale of 1 to 10. Are you already feeling emotionally invested in Sandra's outcome? Drop your rating in the comments, because your engagement tells me what stories resonate most with you. And here's what I want to know. Have you ever been underestimated because of your appearance, job, or background? Share your story in the comments below. Sometimes the best lessons come from our own experiences with being overlooked. Now, let's get back to Sandra's story, because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about first impressions, Sandra. Elena Martinez had worked for the Pemberton family for 3 years, arriving each morning at 7:30 sharp with a travel mug of coffee that cost less than what Victoria spent on a single manicure. She navigated the morning chaos with quiet efficiency, laying out school clothes, preparing nutritious breakfasts that the children would actually eat, and somehow managing to make even the most mundane tasks feel special. The family members walked by her as if she were expensive furniture, necessary, well-maintained, but not quite worthy of real notice or conversation. She was Sandra the nanny, never Sandra the person, and certainly never Sandra the scholar. But Sandra watched. She always watched. She observed how Emma's confidence crumbled every time her mother criticized her appearance. She noticed how Michael's supposed attention problems disappeared when someone actually listened to his creative ideas. She saw how Ryan's academic anxiety stemmed from parents who measured love in grade point averages. During her lunch breaks, while the children napped or played, Sandra would sit in her beat-up Honda Civic and work on her dissertation. Her laptop held, together with electrical tape, displayed research that could revolutionize how schools address educational inequality. She interviewed families from all socioeconomic backgrounds, documenting how assumptions about intelligence and worth create self-fulfilling prophecies. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was living her research every single day. On that particular Thursday, Sandra heard something that made her stomach tighten with familiar anger. She was organizing the playroom when voices drifted from Victoria's home office, where she was video chatting with her sister in California. "You should see our nanny," Victoria was saying, her voice carrying that particular tone wealthy people use when discussing service staff. "Sweet girl, but you can tell she's never had any real education. She tries so hard to seem smart, but, honestly, Linda, it's almost endearing how out of her depth she is." Sandra moved closer to the doorway, her hands stilling on the children's books. Those words weren't foreign to her. She'd heard variations of them her entire life. From high school guidance counselors who tried to steer her toward more realistic career paths, from undergraduate professors who seemed surprised when she excelled in their classes, from graduate school peers who assumed she was there on diversity quotas rather than merit. She whispered, "Cognitive bias and stereotype threat, classic manifestations of systemic inequality." "What did you say, Sandra?" Victoria had appeared. Suddenly, her phone still in hand, clearly having overheard something. "Oh, nothing, Mrs. Pemberton," Sandra replied with a gentle smile. "Just thinking out loud about the children's learning patterns." Victoria's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Learning patterns? Sandra, you're sweet, but let's leave the educational psychology to the professionals. Why don't you focus on getting their snacks ready?" But deep inside Sandra, something had stirred. Not anger. She'd moved beyond anger years ago. This was something more powerful. Determination crystallized into action. That evening, after the children were asleep and the house had settled into its expensive quiet, Sandra sat in her small apartment across town. The contrast was stark. Her place could fit into the Pembertons' living room, but every inch spoke of purpose and achievement. Textbooks lined makeshift shelves, research papers covered her small dining table, and her laptop screen glowed with the final chapter of her dissertation. On her refrigerator, held up by a magnet shaped like an apple, was a photo from her college, graduation 6 years earlier. Her grandmother, Maria Santos Martinez, stood beside her, both women beaming despite the fact that they'd had to save for months to afford Sandra's cap and gown. Next to that photo was another, Sandra receiving her master's degree while her grandmother watched from a wheelchair, too sick to stand but too proud to miss her granddaughter's achievement. Maria had passed away during Sandra's second year of doctoral studies, but not before making Sandra promise to "show them what we're really made of, mija." Sandra picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found Dr. Patricia Williams. Her finger hovered over the number as she gathered her courage. The Pemberton family had no idea that their simple nanny had been working with one of Harvard's most respected education researchers, or that her dissertation on socioeconomic assumptions and educational outcomes had been praised as groundbreaking and essential reading for anyone serious about educational reform. The phone rang twice before Dr. Williams answered. "Sandra, I was just thinking about you. How's the final chapter coming along?" "It's finished, Dr. Williams. All of it. And I'm ready to defend." "That's wonderful. I knew you'd push through. When were you thinking? May? June?" Sandra took a deep breath. "Next week, actually. And I have a special request." She explained her situation, not seeking sympathy, but providing context for what she was about to ask. Dr. Williams listened without interruption, and when Sandra finished, there was a long pause. "Sandra," her advisor said finally, "what you're describing, it's exactly why your research matters. These attitudes, these assumptions, they're not just academic concepts. They have real impact on real people. I know. I've been living it. Give me until tomorrow. I'll make some calls. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right." After hanging up, Sandra walked to her bedroom closet, and pulled out a garment bag she hadn't touched in months. Inside was her graduation gown from her master's ceremony, the one her grandmother had insisted on buying despite the financial strain. She'd wanted Sandra to keep it for the next time. Sandra held the gown against herself and looked in the mirror. Tomorrow, she would return to the Pemberton house and continue her role as their underestimated nanny. But next week, everything would change. She thought about Emma, Michael, and Ryan, children who deserve to grow up understanding that intelligence comes in many forms, and respect should be given freely, not earned through meeting arbitrary social expectations. This wasn't about revenge. This was about education in its truest form. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp April air that makes new beginnings feel possible. Sandra entered the Pemberton mansion at her usual time, but she carried herself differently. There was an energy humming beneath her calm exterior, like electricity waiting to arc. The family's morning routine unfolded predictably. Richard Pemberton barely glanced up from his Wall Street Journal as she prepared his coffee, exactly how he liked it. Victoria rushed through the kitchen in her designer workout clothes, grabbing a protein smoothie while barking instructions about carpools and dinner reservations. "Sandra, I need you to stay until 8 tonight," Victoria said, without looking up from her phone. "Richard's colleagues are coming for drinks, and I want the house perfect." "Of course, Mrs. Pemberton," Sandra replied, then added quietly, "Actually, I wanted to mention that I'll need next Friday afternoon off. It's quite important." Victoria's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose slightly. "Friday? That's rather short notice. What's so urgent?" Before Sandra could respond, Victoria's phone buzzed with a text. Her expression soured as she read it. Ugh, Emma's calculus tutor just canceled. That's $300 down the drain, and her SATs are in 6 weeks. She looked at Sandra with barely concealed frustration. "I don't suppose you have any magical solutions for advanced mathematics?" This time, Sandra didn't hesitate. She'd spent the night reviewing Emma's textbook, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to understand exactly where the teenager was struggling. "Actually, Mrs. Pemberton, I noticed Emma's main issue isn't with the calculus itself. She's struggling with confidence. When she gets anxious, she second-guesses concepts she actually understands quite well." Victoria's laugh was sharp and condescending. "Sandra, sweetie, I appreciate your observations about the children, but this is advanced academic material. Emma needs real tutoring from someone with actual credentials." "I understand your concern," Sandra said gently. "But sometimes the most effective teaching comes from understanding the student, not just the subject matter." "Understanding the student?" Victoria's voice rose slightly, causing Richard to look up from his newspaper with mild annoyance. "Sandra, you're a nanny, a perfectly lovely nanny. But let's not pretend you're qualified to diagnose academic issues." The words hung in the air, like smoke from an extinguished candle. Richard cleared his throat and returned to his reading, clearly uncomfortable with his wife's tone but unwilling to intervene. Sandra felt something shift inside her chest. Not anger, but a crystalline clarity that cut through years of accepted diminishment. "You're right," she said quietly. "I am a nanny, and I love taking care of your children. But Mrs. Pemberton, credentials don't always come in the packages we expect them to." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "What exactly are you trying to say?" Before Sandra could answer, Emma appeared in the doorway, her face already showing the stress lines that had become too common for a 17-year-old. "Mom, I can't find my calculus book anywhere, and I have that practice test today. It's on your desk under the chemistry notes," Sandra said gently. "And Emma, Remember what we talked about yesterday? When you feel the anxiety starting, take 3 deep breaths and remind yourself that you've already proven you can handle these concepts. Emma's face brightened. Oh yeah, the thing about breaking down the problem into smaller steps. That actually worked on my homework last night. Victoria's expression shifted from dismissive to confused. What thing? Sandra, what have you been telling my daughter? Just some study techniques, Sandra replied. Emma is incredibly intelligent, Mrs. Pemberton. She just needs to trust herself more. Study techniques? Victoria's voice carried a dangerous edge. Sandra, I need to be very clear about boundaries here. Your job is childcare, not education. We have professionals for academics. The kitchen fell silent except for the quiet hum of expensive appliances. Richard's newspaper rustled as he turned a page, pretending not to listen to a conversation that was clearly making him uncomfortable. Emma looked between her mother and Sandra, her teenage intuition picking up on the tension. But Mom, Sandra's really good at explaining things. She helped me understand that Shakespeare unit too, and Emma, go get ready for school, Victoria interrupted. Sandra and I need to have a private conversation. After Emma reluctantly left, Victoria turned back to Sandra with the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. Look, Sandra, I think we need to clarify some things. You're wonderful with the children, truly. But I'm starting to worry that you might be overstepping. The children need to respect the difference between childcare and actual education. Sandra met Victoria's gaze steadily. I would never want to overstep, Mrs. Pemberton. I care deeply about Emma, Michael, and Ryan's well-being. Their well-being, yes, but not their education. That's not your area of expertise. The words landed, like stones in still water, creating ripples that spread through Sandra's composure. She thought about her grandmother, who had cleaned houses for families like the Pembertons, but never let anyone make her feel small. She thought about her research, sitting in folders that could change how thousands of children learn. She thought about the children upstairs, who deserved better than parents who measured worth by tax brackets and zip codes. Mrs. Pemberton, Sandra said, her voice remaining gentle but gaining strength. What if I told you that expertise sometimes comes from unexpected places? Victoria's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. Sandra, please, let's not turn this into some kind of philosophical discussion. You're a lovely girl, but let's be realistic about qualifications and education levels. That phrase, education levels, hung in the air between them like a challenge. Sandra felt her phone buzz in her pocket and knew without looking that it was probably Dr. Williams with news about next week. You're absolutely right about education being important, Sandra said quietly. More important than most people realize. She excused herself to check on the children, but as she walked up the marble staircase, her hand brushed against her phone. One text message. Everything is arranged. Friday, 2 p.m., Memorial Hall. Make sure they understand this is a Harvard doctoral. Defense. Not just any graduation. P.W. At the top of the stairs, Sandra paused and looked back down at Victoria, who was already on her phone scheduling yet another expensive tutor for Emma. In her mind, Sandra could hear her grandmother's voice. Sometimes, Mija, the greatest education is teaching people not to judge a book by its cover. 6 more days. Sandra smiled to herself and went to help the children get ready for school, knowing that very soon the conversation about education levels would take a very different turn. In her small apartment that evening, Sandra sat cross-legged on her second-hand couch, her laptop balanced on her knees and stacks of research papers creating towers around her like a paper fortress. The contrast between this cramped space and the Pemberton mansion was stark, but these walls held something the Pembertons' marble and crystal never could: the weight of dreams fought for and earned. On the coffee table before her lay a leather portfolio her grandmother had given her years ago. "Para tus documentos importantes," Maria had said, pressing it into Sandra's hands during her undergraduate graduation. Important papers need a proper home. Sandra opened the portfolio now, her fingers tracing over documents that told the story of a journey the Pembertons couldn't imagine. Her bachelor's degree in education, magna cum laude from UCLA, her master's in educational psychology from UC Berkeley, where she'd graduated at the top of her class. Letters of recommendation from professors who described her as brilliant, innovative, and destined to reshape educational theory. But the document that mattered most was the one folded carefully at the back: her acceptance letter to Harvard's doctoral program in education, dated 5 years ago. "Ms. Martinez," it read, "your research proposal on socioeconomic bias in educational assessment represents exactly the kind of groundbreaking work Harvard seeks to support. Your full fellowship begins in September." Full fellowship. At Harvard. While Victoria Pemberton struggled with her book club's amateur psychology discussions, Sandra had been studying under some of the world's most respected educational researchers. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so painful. Sandra pulled up her dissertation on the laptop screen. "Hidden Brilliance: How Socioeconomic Assumptions Create Educational Barriers and the Interventions That Break Them Down." 450 pages of research that had taken her into schools across 3 states, interviewing hundreds of students, teachers, and families. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Dr. Williams's name appeared on the screen. "Sandra, I've been thinking about Friday all day," her advisor began without preamble. "Are you certain about doing your defense publicly? Traditionally, these are smaller, more academic affairs." Sandra leaned back against her couch cushions, looking around her small apartment. On every wall were photos documenting her journey, receiving scholarships, graduating with honors, presenting research at conferences, and in every photo, her grandmother was there, beaming with pride despite never having finished elementary school herself. "Dr. Williams, my entire dissertation is about how we underestimate people based on their circumstances, how we assume that intelligence and worth are determined by visible markers of status. I've been living this research for 3 years. The Pemberton family? They're good people, in their way, but they've never seen me as anything more than hired help. Victoria actually laughed yesterday when I tried to help with her daughter's math homework. She said I should leave the educational psychology to the professionals." Dr. Williams was quiet for a moment. "Sandra, your work on educational bias scored the highest evaluation scores I've seen in 15 years of academia. You've been published in 3 major journals. The American Educational Research Association wants you to present your findings at their national conference. I know. But none of that matters if we can't bridge the gap between research and reality. If we can't show people that brilliance exists everywhere, not just in the places they expect to find it." Sandra stood and walked to her small kitchen, where another photo hung on the refrigerator. Her grandmother at age 16, having just arrived in Los Angeles from Mexico with nothing but determination and a dream of better opportunities for her family. "My grandmother cleaned houses for 50 years, Sandra continued. She was one of the wisest women I ever knew. But people saw her accent and her uniform and assumed she was simple. She used to tell me, 'Mija, education isn't just about what you learn in school. It's about teaching the world to see clearly.' And you think Friday will do that?" Sandra returned to her couch and looked at her acceptance letter again. Dr. Williams, I want to invite the Pembertons to my defense. All of them. Sandra? Dr. Williams's voice carried a note of concern. Not for revenge. For revelation. Emma, their daughter, is brilliant, but has no confidence because she's been raised to believe that intelligence is something you buy, not something you develop. Michael has learning differences that his parents dismiss as laziness because they don't understand that different doesn't mean deficient. And Ryan is so anxious about academic performance that he's making himself sick. Sandra paused, gathering her thoughts. These children deserve to see that knowledge and wisdom can come from anywhere. That the woman who's been taking care of them, who's been dismissed as just the nanny, has spent 5 years conducting research that could change how their entire generation learns. What about the parents? Sandra smiled, thinking about Victoria's condescending laughter and Richard's uncomfortable silence during that morning's confrontation. The parents need to learn that respect isn't about matching their expectations. It's about recognizing the full humanity in every person they encounter. Maybe if they understand that they've been sitting in judgment of someone whose credentials exceed their own, they'll think twice before doing it again. She opened her laptop and began typing an email. I'm going to send them an invitation tonight, Sandra said. Formal, on Harvard letterhead, to attend the doctoral defense of Sandra. Elena Martinez for her PhD in education. Are you prepared for their reaction? Sandra thought about Emma's face lighting up when she finally understood a calculus concept. She thought about Michael's creativity blooming when someone actually listened to his ideas. She thought about Ryan confiding his fears to her because she was the only adult in his life who didn't judge his anxiety as weakness. Dr. Williams, I've been preparing for this my entire life. Not just the defense. The moment when I get to show everyone that brilliance doesn't come with a pedigree, it comes with persistence, passion, and the courage to keep growing even when people can't see past their own assumptions. After hanging up, Sandra crafted her invitation carefully. Dear Pemberton family, you are cordially invited to attend the doctoral dissertation defense of Sandra Elena Martinez at Harvard University's Graduate School of Education. Ms. Martinez will be defending her research on educational bias and socioeconomic assumptions in learning environments. Date: Friday, April 15th. Time: 2:00 p.m. Location: Memorial Hall, Harvard University. Title: Hidden Brilliance, Breaking Down Educational Barriers. The ceremony is open to the public, and we would be honored by your presence. Dr. Patricia Williams, Dissertation Committee Chair. She printed it on her own printer, but the Harvard letterhead made it official. Tomorrow, she would deliver it personally, because sometimes the most important lessons happen outside the classroom. The Pemberton house was still draped in morning shadows when Sandra arrived at 7:15, 15 minutes earlier than usual. She'd spent the night rehearsing this moment, but now, standing in the marble foyer with the Harvard invitation in her hands, her heart hammered against her ribs like a bird seeking freedom. She moved through her morning routine with quiet precision, but every task carried additional weight. Making Emma's lunch felt like preparing for a battle. Organizing Michael's backpack became an act of faith. Even folding Ryan's clean laundry seemed symbolic of putting things in their proper order. The family emerged at their usual scattered intervals. Richard grabbed his coffee while scanning emails on his phone. Victoria swept through in her yoga attire, already multitasking between her calendar and a call with her personal trainer. The children stumbled downstairs in various states of morning drowsiness. But this morning, Sandra wasn't invisible. Mrs. Pemberton, she said gently, approaching Victoria as she ended her phone call. I have something I'd like to give you. Victoria glanced up with mild irritation, clearly expecting another request for time off, or perhaps a household concern. "What is it, Sandra? I'm running late for my class." Sandra extended the envelope, Harvard's crimson seal clearly visible even in the morning light. "An invitation for you and your family." Victoria took the envelope, her manicured fingers tracing over the university letterhead with growing confusion. She opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the formal language once, then twice, then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. The kitchen grew quiet, except for the sound of Richard's coffee cup meeting, marble and Emma's cereal spoon scraping against ceramic. "I don't understand," Victoria said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. This is a doctoral defense invitation. From Harvard." "Yes," Sandra replied simply. "For someone named Sandra Martinez. That's me." The silence that followed was so complete that Sandra could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, marking seconds that felt like hours. Richard looked up from his phone for the first time all morning. "Sandra? Our Sandra?" Emma stopped, eating mid-bite. "What's happening?" Victoria's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been recognition. She read the invitation again, this time aloud. "Ms. Martinez will be defending her research on educational bias and socioeconomic assumptions in learning environments." She looked up sharply. "Is this some kind of mistake?" Sandra met her gaze, steadily. "No mistake, Mrs. Pemberton. I've been working on my doctorate for the past 5 years. I finish my defense this Friday." "Your doctorate?" Victoria's voice pitched higher. "You have a doctorate? You're getting a PhD from Harvard?" "Yes, ma'am." The family stared at her, as if she'd announced she could fly. Michael, in his 8-year-old directness, broke the silence first. "So Sandra's like super smart? Like genius smart?" Before Sandra could respond, Emma found her voice. "Wait. When you were helping me with calculus, when you explained those study techniques, you actually knew what you were talking about?" "I've been studying educational psychology for years," Sandra said gently. "I noticed you were experiencing test anxiety, which is actually very common and completely manageable with the right strategies." Ryan, who had been quiet through the entire exchange, suddenly straightened. "Is that why you never made me feel stupid about my panic attacks? Because you actually understand anxiety?" Sandra turned to him with the same gentle expression she'd worn during their private conversations. "Anxiety doesn't mean weakness, Ryan. It just means your brain processes stress differently. There are techniques that can help." Victoria was still staring at the invitation as if it might disappear. But you work as a nanny." "I work as a nanny because I needed a job that would let me complete my research," Sandra explained, "and because I love children. But Mrs. Pemberton, having a PhD doesn't change who I am. I'm still the same person who's been taking care of your family." Richard cleared his throat, his businessman's mind apparently processing the implications, faster than his wife's. "Sandra, when you tried to help with Emma's homework, when you made suggestions about the children's learning, you were speaking from actual expertise?" "Yes, sir. And he stopped, the words catching in his throat as he realized what they'd done. Emma stood up from her chair, her 17-year-old understanding cutting through the adult's shock. "Oh my God. Mom, you totally dismissed her. Yesterday, when she tried to help with my math, you basically told her she wasn't smart enough." Victoria's face flushed red. "I didn't. I mean, how was I supposed to know?" "That intelligence comes in different packages?" Sandra asked quietly. That's actually part of what my research addresses. How our assumptions about education and ability are often based on external markers rather than actual knowledge. The kitchen fell silent again, but this time the silence carried weight. The weight of recognition, embarrassment, and the slow dawning of understanding. Sandra looked at each family member in turn. The invitation is genuine. My defense is public, and you're welcome to attend. My research focuses on how educational bias affects children's learning outcomes and how we can create more inclusive approaches to recognizing and nurturing intelligence. She paused, then added softly, I think you might find it interesting. Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out small and uncertain. Friday afternoon, 2 o'clock. Memorial Hall at Harvard. Will other people be there? Sandra nodded. My committee, other faculty members, some graduate students. It's open to anyone who wants to attend. The implications hung in the air like morning mist. The woman they'd dismissed as just the nanny would be defending doctoral research at one of the world's most prestigious universities, in front of Harvard faculty, while they sat in the audience as guests. Richard was the first to regain his composure. Sandra, I think we owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything, Sandra replied. But maybe we can all learn something from this experience. She gathered her things to take the children to school, moving with the same quiet efficiency she'd always shown. But something fundamental had shifted in the household's dynamics. The invisible woman had become visible, and nothing would ever be quite the same. As they left for school, Emma whispered to Sandra, Can I ask you about college applications? Like, for real advice this time? Sandra smiled. Of course, I'd be honored to help. Behind them, Victoria stood in her marble foyer, still holding the Harvard invitation, finally understanding that she'd been living with brilliance all along. By Thursday evening, the news had traveled through the Pemberton social circle like wildfire through dry grass. Victoria's sister in California had called within hours of receiving a frantic phone call. The book club group chat buzzed with speculation and disbelief. Margaret Chen had even driven over unannounced, ostensibly to see how Victoria was handling everything. Sandra arrived Friday morning to find the household in a state of barely controlled chaos. Victoria paced the kitchen in her designer robe, her usual morning routine abandoned in favor of anxious energy and multiple phone calls. Richard sat at the breakfast bar with his laptop, but Sandra could see he wasn't actually working. He was researching her name on academic databases. Sandra Elena Martinez, Harvard, she heard him mutter, scrolling through search results. Published researcher? Educational psychology? Oh my God, Victoria! Look at this! Victoria rushed over to peer at the screen. What? She's been published in the Journal of Educational Psychology 3 times. And look, she presented at a national conference last year on cognitive bias in educational settings. Richard's voice grew quieter as he read, She's not just getting a PhD, Victoria. She's already an established researcher. Sandra entered the kitchen quietly, carrying Michael's forgotten lunchbox from his backpack. The conversation stopped abruptly, both parents looking at her with expressions she couldn't quite read, somewhere between embarrassment and awe. Good morning, Sandra said gently. Michael left this upstairs. Victoria cleared her throat. Sandra, Richard was just... She gestured helplessly at the laptop. Looking up my research? Sandra finished kindly. That's understandable. Richard closed the laptop with careful precision. Sandra, I think we need to have a conversation. a real conversation. Of course, Mr. Pemberton. They sat around the breakfast table where Sandra had served hundreds of meals, but this time she joined them as an equal. The children were still upstairs getting ready for school, their voices and footsteps providing a familiar soundtrack to an unfamiliar moment. Victoria spoke first, her voice uncharacteristically small. "Sandra, I owe you an enormous apology. We all do. The way I spoke to you about Emma's homework, the way I dismissed your suggestions about the children's education. You couldn't have known," Sandra said gently. "But that's just it." Richard interrupted. "I should have known that intelligence doesn't come with a uniform. The way you speak, the way you observe, the way you connect with our children, those aren't accidents." Sandra nodded quietly. "Thank you for saying that." Emma appeared in the doorway, school bag slung over her shoulder, but she stopped when she saw the serious expressions around the table. "Is everything okay?" Victoria looked at her daughter, then at Sandra, understanding finally dawning in her eyes. "Emma, sit down for a moment. There's something important we need to tell you about Sandra." As the family gathered around the breakfast table, Sandra found herself in the strange position of explaining her academic journey to people who had watched her fold their laundry and pack their lunches for 3 years. "I started my doctoral program the same year I began working here," she explained. "I needed a job that would give me flexibility for research, and I genuinely love working with children. But I also needed to understand, from the inside, how educational bias actually plays out in daily life." Ryan, who had quietly joined them, spoke up with the perceptiveness that had made Sandra appreciate him. "So we were like part of your research." "Not subjects," Sandra clarified quickly, "but living examples of how brilliant young people can be held back by systems that don't recognize their individual strengths." She turned to Michael, who was listening with 8-year-old intensity. "Michael, remember when you told me about your idea for a story about numbers that have feelings? That's not childish thinking. That's creative mathematical reasoning. Some of the best mathematicians think exactly that way." Michael's face lit up with recognition and validation. "And Emma," Sandra continued, "your anxiety about calculus isn't because you can't understand it. It's because you've been taught that intelligence is about being perfect instead of being curious." Emma nodded slowly, pieces clicking into place. "That's why you always said mistakes are just learning opportunities." Because they are. That's not just something adults say to make children feel better. It's actually how the brain develops. Expertise. Victoria sat back in her chair, looking overwhelmed. "Sandra, I feel terrible. Not just about dismissing your help, but about everything. The way I talked about you to my friends, the assumptions I made. Mrs. Pemberton, you're not a bad person for making assumptions based on limited information. But maybe this experience can help us all think differently about how we see people." Richard cleared his throat, his businessman's mind working through implications. "Sandra, what you're describing, this research on educational bias, how significant is it?" "Significant enough that the American Educational Research Association has invited me to present at their national conference. Significant enough that 3 school districts are already implementing pilot programs based on my recommendations." The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet of earlier. This was the silence of people realizing they had fundamentally misunderstood something important. "What does this mean for us?" Victoria asked quietly. "For your job here?" Sandra smiled gently. "That's actually what I wanted to discuss. After my defense, I'll be starting as an assistant professor of education at the local university. But if you're willing, I'd like to continue working with Emma, Michael, and Ryan, not as their nanny, but as their educational mentor. "You'd still want to work with us?" Emma asked, her voice small. "After the way after how Mom—" "Emma, I've watched you grow for 3 years. I've seen your creativity, your determination, your kindness. Why wouldn't I want to continue being part of your education?" Victoria stood up abruptly and walked to the kitchen window, her shoulders tense. When she turned back, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I need to ask you something, Sandra, and I need you to be honest. When I laughed at you yesterday, when I dismissed your help, how did that make you feel?" Sandra considered the question carefully. "Sad. Not angry. I stopped being angry at those kinds of reactions years ago. But sad because it meant you couldn't see the help I was trying to offer your daughter. And sad because it showed me how many other people must be dismissed every day based on what others assume about them." "I was wrong," Victoria said simply. "Not just factually wrong, but morally wrong. I should have listened to you because you were offering to help my child, regardless of what degrees I thought you did or didn't have." Richard nodded slowly. "Sandra, I've been in business for 20 years, and I thought I was good at recognizing talent, but I completely missed it when it was right in front of me every day." Ryan spoke up with teenage directness. "So, Sandra, at your defense thing on Friday, you're going to be the smartest person in the room?" Sandra laughed, the first truly relaxed sound she'd made all morning. "Ryan, I'm going to be one of many smart people in the room. That's the wonderful thing about academia. It's full of people who are passionate about learning and discovering new things." "Can we come?" Michael asked suddenly. "To your graduation thing?" Sandra looked around the table at faces that had transformed from dismissive to engaged, from condescending to respectful. "I would be honored to have you there, but I want you to understand what you'll be seeing. When I defend my research, I'll be presenting evidence about how educational bias affects children just like you. Some of that research came from observations I made right here, in this house." Emma leaned forward. "Will you tell them about us?" "Only in aggregate data. No names, no identifying details. But yes, some of my research includes observations about how anxiety, learning differences, and family expectations impact student performance." Victoria sat back down. Her composure returned, but her perspective clearly altered. "Sandra, I want you to know, whatever you need for Friday, whatever support we can provide, we're here. And I think we all need to hear what you have to say." As the family finally left for school and work that morning, Sandra stood alone in the familiar kitchen. In 6 hours, she would defend 5 years of research at Harvard University. But right now, she felt like she had already accomplished something equally important. She had opened minds and challenged assumptions in the place where she spent most of her days. The most profound education, she reflected, often happens outside the classroom. Memorial Hall at Harvard University was a cathedral of academic achievement, its soaring Gothic windows casting long shadows across rows of wooden chairs filled with faculty, graduate students, and invited guests. Sandra stood in the preparation room adjacent to the main hall, adjusting her doctoral hood with steady hands while her heart hammered against her ribs. Through the partially open door, she could hear the murmur of arriving attendees. Dr. Williams appeared beside her, carrying the final printed copies of Sandra's dissertation. "The committee is ready when you are," her advisor said quietly. "But Sandra, I want you to know, in 15 years of overseeing doctoral defenses, I've never seen research that so elegantly bridges theory and lived experience. Sandra nodded, touching the small silver cross at her throat. Thank you, Dr. Williams, for everything. Are you ready? Sandra looked out at the assembled crowd and spotted them immediately. The Pemberton family, sitting in the third row like students waiting for class to begin. Victoria wore a navy dress that struck Sandra as unusually understated for her usual style. Richard sat with his hands folded, his typical businessman's confidence replaced by genuine curiosity. And the children, Emma, Michael, and Ryan, looked around the impressive hall with wide-eyed appreciation for the gravity of the moment. I'm ready. The next 90 minutes passed in a blur of academic ritual and intellectual rigor. Sandra presented her research with the confidence of someone who had lived every data point and understood the real-world implications of every statistical analysis. Her voice carried clearly through the hall as she explained her methodology, her findings, and her recommendations. Educational bias isn't just about test scores or college admissions, she said, clicking to a slide that showed her key findings. It's about the daily messages we send children about their worth, their potential, and their place in the world. When we assume that intelligence looks a certain way, comes from certain backgrounds, or speaks with certain accents, we create barriers to learning that can last a lifetime. During the question and answer period, a professor from MIT raised his hand. Dr. Martinez, your research suggests that some of the most effective educational interventions come from unexpected sources. Can you elaborate on what you mean by unconventional educators? Sandra's eyes found the Pemberton family in the audience. I mean recognizing that wisdom and knowledge exist in places we might not immediately think to look. The grandmother, who never finished high school, but understands how children learn. The nanny who helps with homework not because she has to, but because she understands both the subject matter and the child. The janitor who notices which students seem hungry and makes sure they have access to food, understanding that nutrition affects cognitive performance. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. We've created artificial hierarchies in education that suggest only people with certain credentials can contribute to a child's learning. But children don't learn from credentials. They learn from connection, understanding, and genuine care. When the formal defense concluded, Dr. Williams stood with visible pride. The committee has deliberated, and it is our unanimous decision that Sandra Elena Martinez has successfully defended her doctoral dissertation. Congratulations, Dr. Martinez. The applause was thunderous, but Sandra heard only one sound clearly. Michael's voice calling out, "That's our Sandra!" before being gently hushed by his mother. After the ceremony, as faculty members and fellow graduate students offered congratulations, Sandra found herself surrounded by the Pemberton family. Emma was the first to reach her. Dr. Martinez, the ETO teenager said, emphasizing the title with obvious pride. That was incredible. When you talked about anxiety and learning, I felt like you were speaking directly to me. I was, in part, Sandra replied gently. Everything I said about recognizing and nurturing different kinds of intelligence, that includes you, Emma, all of you. Victoria stepped forward, her usual social confidence replaced by something more genuine. Sandra, Dr. Martinez, I don't even know what to say. Listening to you present that research, watching how the professors respected your work. I keep thinking about all the times Mrs. Pemberton, Sandra interrupted kindly, what matters isn't what happened before. What matters is what we do going forward. Richard extended his hand formally. Dr. Martinez, I want to apologize for our family, and I want to offer you something. Our family foundation gives grants to educational initiatives. After hearing your presentation today, I'd like to discuss funding for your research. Sandra shook his hand, touched by the gesture but more interested in a different kind of partnership. Thank you, Mr. Pemberton. But what I'd really like is the chance to continue working with your children, not as hired help, but as an educational consultant who can help them develop their individual strengths. Michael tugged on her doctoral gown. Sandra, does this mean you're like a real doctor now? Sandra knelt down to his eye level. I'm the same Sandra I've always been, Michael. I've just learned some new things that can help me be better at helping children learn and grow. Cool, he said with 8-year-old pragmatism. Can you still help me with my math homework? Sandra laughed. Absolutely. But now when I help you, maybe your parents will listen to my suggestions too. Ryan, who had been quiet through most of the ceremony, finally spoke up. Dr. Martinez, when you talked about anxiety and academic performance, you really understand that stuff, don't you? I do, Ryan. And more importantly, I understand that having anxiety doesn't make you weak or incapable. It just means you need different strategies to show how smart you really are. The teenager nodded, something settling in his expression that suggested relief and hope. As the hall began to empty, Dr. Williams approached their group. Dr. Martinez, I hate to interrupt, but the Dean of Education would like to meet with you about a faculty position. Victoria looked stricken. You're leaving us? Sandra smiled, the kind of smile that comes from knowing that everything is falling into place. Not leaving, Mrs. Pemberton. Growing. And taking all of you with me. She turned to Dr. Williams. Tell the Dean I'm very interested, but I have one condition. I want to develop a community outreach program that brings university resources directly to families who might not otherwise access them. As they walked out of Memorial Hall together, Sandra realized that this moment wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of exactly the kind of educational partnership she had been researching for 5 years. The kind where everyone learns, everyone teaches, and everyone grows. The afternoon sun streamed through Harvard's historic windows, casting light on a future where intelligence would be recognized wherever it was found. 6 months later, Sandra stood in her new office at the university, looking out the window at students crossing the quad. The nameplate on her door read, Dr. Sandra Martinez, Assistant Professor of Education and Director of Community Learning Partnerships. But on her desk sat a photo that mattered more than any professional achievement. The Pemberton children at their school's science fair, where Emma had won first place for her project on math anxiety, Michael had created an award-winning display about creative problem-solving, and Ryan had overcome his presentation fears to explain his research on student stress management. Victoria knocked on the open door, carrying 2 coffee cups. Their relationship had evolved into something Sandra had never expected. Genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared commitment to the children's growth. Emma got her early admission letter from MIT, Victoria said, settling into the chair across from Sandra's desk. She wants to study educational psychology, Sandra smiled. She'll be brilliant at it. She understands from experience how learning really works. She says she wants to be like you, someone who helps other kids realize they're smarter than they think. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching students hurry past with backpacks and dreams. Finally, Victoria spoke again. Sandra, I need to ask you something I've been thinking about for months. That day when you invited us to your defense, did you know it would change everything? Sandra considered the question carefully. I hoped it would open some minds. But honestly, Victoria, the real change happened when your family chose to listen instead of just hearing. What's the difference? Hearing is passive. Listening requires you to be willing to have your assumptions challenged. Victoria nodded slowly. I've been thinking about that a lot. about how many other people I might have underestimated over the years. Through the window, they could see Michael playing with a group of diverse children in the university's new Family Learning Center, a program Sandra had developed that brought together families from all backgrounds for educational activities that celebrated different kinds of intelligence. You know what the most important thing I learned from this experience was? Sandra asked. What? That the best education doesn't happen when we teach people facts. It happens when we teach them to see possibilities they never noticed before. Victoria raised her coffee cup in a small toast. To seeing clearly. To seeing clearly, Sandra agreed. Outside, the afternoon light fell evenly on students of every background, every dream, every hidden brilliance waiting to be recognized. And in her office, Dr. Sandra Martinez continued the work she had always done, helping people discover the extraordinary potential that exists in ordinary moments when someone finally takes the time to look.